All right, thank you very much. As he said, my name is Amy Rose. I'm an engineer at the National Renewable Energy Lab. My colleague, David Palchek, on Wednesday gave an overview of NREL's approach to planning and some of our planning activities here in India. The purpose today is to really take a deep dive on one of these studies and look at the capacity expansion study we've done here in India. This was in a loose collaboration with CEA, really targeted at creating a tool that can help make informed decisions about generation and transmission planning and see how the system will evolve over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so in pursuit of this, we wanted to develop state-of-the-art planning tools and databases that can help inform investment decisions, increase the technical rigor and granularity and levels of detail that are going into these planning tools, and then actually implement them and model a series of different pathways for India's future power system. To do this, we use the REEDS, which is the Regional Energy Deployment System. It's a model developed at NREL over a decade ago, and it's well known for its rigorous treatment of the spatial, the temporal, the operational aspects of variable renewable energy in the planning process. REEDS has been used for a number of studies to answer questions ranging from what's the impact of a particular policy or technology on the power system in the future to what would happen if there was a much broader electrification of the whole economy. And what REEDS does is it finds the mix of generation, transmission, and storage technologies that meet the needs of the power system in the future. And by needs, we don't just mean electricity demand. Also reserve requirements, policy requirements, environmental requirements, anything that the system might need to think about in the future. And what you get out of REEDS is what to build, where to build it, and when. So I'll just briefly provide an overview of the model before I go into detailed results. This is a linear optimization tool that's implemented in the GAM software. We have two layers of temporal scope. First, the model years, or the planning horizon, dictates how far out into the future you're going to look. And then within each model year, we look at a number of representative periods in that year that look at different times of day across a range of seasons. And this is really designed to capture correlations between load, the availability of different resources like hydro throughout the year, and then during the day, the availability of wind and solar. Geographically, we have multiple spatial layers. We've aggregated load, transmission, and generation to the state level. So we model 34 states in India. And then for wind and solar, we've actually modeled 146 different regions, which we call resource regions. And so we have this added level of geographic detail for wind and solar to capture the big differences in that resource around the country. REEDS considers a variety of different technology options from different generation technologies, transmission, and storage. And then finally, I just want to highlight some unique features of the model. We are the National Renewable Energy Lab, and so we care very deeply about how renewables are represented in planning models. So we include very detailed geospatial data, not just on resources, but the transmission network and land availability to estimate how much capacity could be built in each part of the country, each of these 146 resource regions, and the cost of developing that resource. On an operational side, we also generate unique generation profiles for wind and solar in each of those 146 regions, instead of just using a single capacity factor or a single profile for all of India. And so when you combine this, we have very detailed information about the availability and the cost of building wind and solar in different parts of the country, and also the generation you could expect from each of those sites. We also try to capture things that are relevant for VRE integration, including the correlation between wind and solar generation across different sites, the cost of building out transmission to reach some of these areas, and we also estimate capacity credit and curtailment. The view that wind and solar is not firm and has no capacity credit is no longer valid. The new debate is about what's the right method to estimate firm capacity from wind and solar. And so we do this by simulating hourly simulations of wind, solar, and solar generation as well as load to estimate seasonal capacity credit of wind, solar, and storage. We also estimate curtailment using stochastic hourly simulations of wind and solar generation, transmission flows, the minimum generation level of conventional plants, and load. And then finally, I'll just highlight that the model is very flexible. So the way we've represented different spatial resolution in India and the time slices, the representative periods of the day in India, look very different than what we've done in studies in the US and Mexico, for example. And so it can be tailored to really fit the area where you're working, the data availability, and the research questions you're trying to answer. So we worked with CEA to develop a range of scenarios that were of interest to CEA and met their needs. We started with a base case scenario where we look at a business as usual growth of capacity and electricity demand. And then we also looked at two alternative cost scenarios where the cost for solar PV declined faster than anticipated, and as well as the cost of batteries falling faster than anticipated. Gas constraints are particularly important here. So we also looked at a new gas scenario where there was more gas available in the future. And then we also looked at two alternative load scenarios. The first evaluated the potential for demand response or load shifting to change the demand profile in the country. And then another scenario where demand grew less than anticipated. And I just want to reiterate something that Robert Hull from the UK said on Wednesday, which is the one thing we can say about all of these scenarios is that all the results will be wrong. We can't predict what the future will be, but this is really important to kind of inform and guide us on where we might go and what needs to be done in the interim to get us down this future path. So let me start with the base case scenario results. The combination of declining technology costs for wind and solar and batteries with rapid demand growth in India has presented a unique position for India's electricity system to transition from a thermal-based system to one that has very high penetrations of renewables. This chart shows the installed capacity from 2017 to 2047, where the fraction of capacity from wind and solar increases from 28% in 2017 to 63% in 2047. Wind and solar are increasingly presenting least cost options to meet future electricity demand. Investments in batteries become economic as early as 2022. And the share of coal in the overall generation mix is on a decline. These maps show for our final year, 2047, where the investments in wind and solar are happening around the country. Some is not surprising. We have Rajasthan, Gujarat, Karnataka. These are the main candidates, Tamil Nadu for wind investments. Utility PV is concentrated at Rajasthan, Gujarat. With distributed PV, this is rooftop PV, we see many more states installing rooftop PV, and this is really due to proximity to major load centers, where that might be an economic option. But for all of these investments, it's really driven by not just resource is a big part of it, but also land availability, access to transmission, and proximity to major load centers. In addition to wind and solar, other resources are not uniformly distributed around the country. And this leads to regional differences in how the generation mix may evolve over time. This map shows in each region the installed capacity in 2017 on the small left bar, 2030 in the middle, and 2047 on the right. And the number next to the bar charts is the total installed capacity in that region in 2047. And so you can see in some areas like the eastern region, the northeastern region, the western region, coal still persists in those areas. Whereas in the northern region and the southern region, there's a lot of wind and solar being built, not much coal, there's not a lot of access to cheap coal, and so there we see gas and battery capacity being used to provide flexibility and balance wind and solar. As I mentioned, REEDS also does transmission investments. It's a simplified version of transmission modeling. We only look at investments between states. The chart on the left shows over the whole planning period, over the 30-year period, the investments in transmission between states. And then on the plots on the right, I've aggregated transmission flows to the regional level to help show how flows around the country are evolving from 2017 to 2047. The first big trend is there's a lot more trade happening in 2047 across all regions of the country. But where this is happening the most is to evacuate power from high RE states to other parts of the country. And if we look at system operations, these plots show in each season of the year and each part of the day that we modeled, we did representative parts of the day, which mix of generation technologies are being used to meet demand during those different parts of the day. The black dots represent load in those parts of the day. And you'll see there are some cases, like in autumn, where this red arrow is, where the generation is higher than that black dot. And those are periods where battery storage is being used to charge the batteries in the middle of the day, and then dispatch the batteries in the evening to meet peak demand. Other trends you'll notice, autumn tends to be a low wind season. So in autumn, there's not a lot of wind generation, and this is where we see gas CT technologies being kept in the system to meet demand during these few months when there's not a lot of wind. By contrast, in the rainy season, there's a lot of wind available. And so here we see some of the lowest generation levels for supercritical coal. The table on the right shows the evolution of the generation mix from 2017 to 2047, where we see the contribution to demand from wind and solar increase from 27% to 56%. By contrast, coal falls from 61% to 32%. But this is not the whole story. Our stochastic simulations show that the system is not able to absorb all of the wind and solar generation that's being produced in 2047. And what happens is we have curtailment, particularly in the middle of the day, which is what you're seeing in these red bars. This totals to about 8% of total wind and solar generation that's being curtailed. And the plot on the right shows which states are experiencing this curtailment. Not surprisingly, it's the states that are building a lot of solar. So let me briefly highlight some of the other scenarios, particularly the alternative cost scenarios, where we looked at a low solar cost and a low battery cost future. The chart on the top shows the comparison of installed capacity from 2017 to 2047 in the base case on the left, the low battery cost scenario in the middle, and the low solar cost scenario on the right. And each of these alternative scenarios changes what gets built and how the system is operated, but in different ways. In the low battery cost scenario, we see more batteries being built, also about 40 gigawatts more of wind and solar being built. But the biggest impact is the improvement in how much of this wind and solar can actually be absorbed in the grid. So we see the percent of demand being met by wind and solar increase from 56% in the base case up to 70% in the low battery cost scenario, and curtailment is falling. By contrast, in the low solar cost scenario, if we reduce the capital cost of solar PV, we're able to build a lot more solar PV, but that doesn't translate to the same level of increase in meeting demand with wind and solar. So we see, in terms of gigawatts, more than 300 more gigawatts of wind and solar being built by 2047, but the percent of demand being met by wind and solar is actually slightly less than what we found in the low battery cost scenario, and curtailment increases. So this is useful to help us think about what are the cost-effective ways of integrating renewable energy into the grid. Where should we focus our research, our policies, and our efforts? And perhaps it's in thinking about ways to access flexibility in a cost-effective way. I will briefly touch on our other alternative scenarios. Overall, they had very marginal impacts on how the system was operated and the investment needs that were needed by 2047. If we increase the availability of gas, this does lead to more wind and solar being built slightly and less coal. With the flat load scenario shifting load from peak periods in the evening to in the middle of the day, this reduces the need for supercritical coal and gas CT to meet peak demand. And it slightly increases wind and solar investments, especially since they can be used in the middle of the day. In the low load growth scenario, it didn't have a huge impact on transmission investments or wind and solar investments. So let me just close with a few key takeaways. First, as I mentioned, the combination of rapid demand growth, falling technology costs, means the India's power system is really poised for a dramatic transformation from a thermal-based system to one with high penetrations of renewables. Under these current projections, the national capacity targets for 2022 and 2030 can be achieved with least cost planning. But at higher penetration levels, we need to shift our thinking to how to access cost-effective sources of flexibility, which may include batteries, but also alternative sources as well. And it might become important to think about curtailment as an economic option of balancing supply and demand more regularly. Other things like changes in demand growth or gas availability didn't have that much of an impact. It's still worth considering in long-term planning because they could be a source of uncertainty. And finally, David mentioned this on Wednesday, but I just want to reiterate, the REEDS model will be open source at the end of this month, and so if you're interested in learning more about it or using it for your own research, please reach out to us or visit the NREL REEDS website, and we'd be happy to let you know about that. Thank you very much.